Hey folks, it's me again. I hope you are doing well. Let me tell you a story. So this story about growing up in Charlestown, Massachusetts is what I like to call the best of times and the worst of times. So when I was in high school, I had to read Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. And I don't really remember a whole lot about the book, but I do remember the opening line, and I remember the opening line because that's about how much of the first chapter I read for homework. And then the next day we had a pub quiz, and the pub quiz was, what's the first line of the book? So the first line of the book, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Now, Dickens is talking about Paris and London, and this was the whole let them eat cake and so forth. So it's you can read the cliff notes on the actual book, because I don't recall a whole lot of it from back then, but I do recall it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, A Tale of Two Cities. And in retrospect, I have started to realize that Charlestown, growing up in Charlestown in the 70s and 80s into the 90s, was also a tale of two cities, or a tale of two towns, if you will. And it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. The best of the times, Charlestown was often described on the news during an incident as a tight-knit community. Sometimes they'd throw in the moniker of hard-working, blue-collar neighborhood. And it was both of those. It was a tight-knit community and was hard-working, blue-collar neighborhood. Most of the people in Charlestown were white, Irish Catholic, typically second-generation Irish. So my grandparents came over from Ireland. They met here in Charlestown and got married in Charlestown. And so there were a lot of big families, and everybody knew everybody. And, that was a bit of, maybe insulation from the outside or whatnot, if you will. But it also helped us, understand who was in our neighborhood and who belonged there and who didn't belong there. And I don't mean people moving in and living and, hey, you don't belong here, but, weird people in the neighborhood, like, who's this guy? What's he doing, walking down the street? Where today, you don't know who's who, because it's such a mix of people that you really don't know who's who. If you knew who people were, you knew who to avoid. Right? When we were growing up, there were certain people who we would see we would avoid. Either they were, bullies, or they were a little bit crazy, or you just didn't know what they were going to do. So it was a little bit, it's good to know who's who. So what I remember growing up in Charlestown was that everybody knew each other, everybody cared for each other, everybody had each other's back. And when I said care about people, that was everything from going to the corner store for the elderly lady who lived across the street from us, Mrs. Doherty. She'd tap on her window, and whichever boy was there, would get ordained to go, run her errands for her. She never gave us a tip. We didn't expect a tip. It was just something that you did for your neighbors. The other thing was, oftentimes families would cook a little extra food. Oh, I made too much. Give this to the neighbor down the street. There was a family in town who their mother and my mother were great friends, and they were doing a little worse off than we were. None of us were doing well. Charlestown was a poor dump in the 70s. But in any case, once in a while we would deliver a bag of clothes that we had outgrown and give them to their family. So another big thing was, hey, there's a time at the Knights. And a time at the Knights meant that there was a fundraiser at the Knights of Columbus, and they still do them to this day. 200-300 people will show up. What can I do? What can I donate? How can I help out a friend in need? And so typically that was to raise money. I don't know, maybe a parent was sick, or there was an incident with a kid, or a fire in the house, or whatever it might be, and people would jump in and help. I think the other great thing that made it the best of times was Bunker Hill Day. So Bunker Hill Day in Charlestown is the biggest holiday of the year. and it commemorates the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was 1775. And, the Bunker Hill Monument is in Charlestown and all that. But on that day, actually that whole weekend, what would happen is relatives from far away or, the next town or whatever would show up. Now, back then, these Irish families, the average was 8 kids in a family. So you've got all of those. Then you've got the cousins coming back. So the streets were teeming with kids. If you Google, old pictures of the Bunker Hill Day Parade, the sidewalks are literally 10 people deep with kids. So that was always a good time. We were able to have soda, or tonic as we call it back then, still now. My mother would get some root beer and some orangeade and ginger ale, and we were able to have some of that. As years went on, we graduated up to other cold beverages. But on Bunker Hill Day, everybody was friends. Everybody was hanging out together. It did, because there was a lot of drinking going on, it would tend to be the day that there were some fights later in the afternoon. I was never involved in any of them, but I did see a few what we call Donnybrooks going on with fights. So those were the best of times, right? You had friends, you had family, people cared for each other. But then there was the worst of times, right? The drugs, the murders, the bank robbers, the pedophiles. And so in the 80s, there was in Charlestown, I guess it was elsewhere too, but there was an influx of PCP, also known as angel dust. And so there were kids in town that we would refer to as dust mops. You could tell who was dusted out because they would walk like they were walking on eggshells. You'd see these kids walking down the street and also you would stay away from them because apparently it gives you like a superhuman strength. So you don't want one of those people attacking you. There are stories of the older kids who used to smoke dust and then go lift weights. And they were huge. They were all ripped because, they're probably lifting 300 pounds where they usually maybe could lift 150 pounds. But so there was angel dust. There was always weed around. But also in the 80s, Coke became big. And so there were, a lot of I would say the people who were murdered in town, a lot of it was over drugs, right? Either they ripped someone off or they were, trying to sell drugs in someone else's area or whatnot. So cocaine was big in the 80s. Then there's the murders, right? Between 1975 and 92, there were almost 50 murders in Charlestown. 33 of them are still unsolved, even though everybody in the town knows who did them. My first experience seeing a dead body was I was in about 3rd grade. I was walking to school, and I walked by this bridge, and under the bridge was a bar called McAvoy's, and there was a guy asleep next to a dumpster. He was leaning up against the dumpster. So I saw that in the morning on my way to school. We used to go home for lunch. I was going home for lunch. I look over. The guy is still there. He wasn't sleeping. He was dead. Later in the afternoon, it came out, who the guy was. I don't remember his name, but he was shot outside the bar and left there to die next to a dumpster. Also, when I was in probably 6th grade, maybe, one of my classmates' brother was murdered over, something stupid. I don't know exactly what it was, but it typically was something stupid. And so his brother was murdered in this alley that was known as Dead Man's Alley. And part of the reason was that a few people had been killed in that alley. But most of these murders were over women, drugs, or money. I know one guy who was killed because he grabbed some girl's ass. And the boyfriend heard about it and came and shot the guy in the head, killed him. There was another guy who we actually saw die in the street. He was killed over $50 worth of coke. He gave these teenagers fake money. And once they found out it was fake, they went and got guns and gunned them down over $50. There's others who were killed because of just personal vendettas, right? They hated this person for one reason or the other. Or some would start out as fist fights, and then this one hit this one and that one, and a fight with this brother and that brother. Next thing you know, people are getting shot. And then there were bank robbers. So apparently not apparently, but Charlestown was known for bank robbers, but apparently they weren't that great because there seemed to be a whole lot of them in jail. Eventually they got out, but when I was growing up, there seemed to be a lot who were in jail for bank robbery. I don't know too many of those, but I do know some kids who decided that, and they were 18, 19 at the time, decided they're going to rob an armored car in Harvard Square. And the idea with armored cars are the guards will just give up the money, right? They're getting paid $10 an hour. They don't care about the money. It's insured. Well, not this guy. They tried to rob this armored car and in Harvard Square, and the guard pulled out a gun and shot a couple of them, and eventually the rest of them got caught too. So that didn't really work out well for them. And then I haven't heard of any attempted armored car robberies in probably 20 years. I think people realized it's not worth it. And then, the ugly side of things, there were the pedophiles, right? Coaches, priests, uncles, these people used to stay over people's houses. I know there was a coach in town that also worked at a pool, and he liked to towel off little boys, help them dry themselves off after they went swimming. And, who knows what happened in the locker rooms, because these people, the problem with these people is they were trusted, right? The coaches, you're trusting your kids, you're trusting them with your kids. Same thing with priests. I was an altar boy, and I was never, inappropriately touched by a priest or anything. But I was told one time that I was going to go to hell. And, that scares, no pun intended, scares the hell out of a kid, right? We were on a day trip to this place called the Blue Hills Reservation. So we're out, exploring the hills and whatnot. And there was this little nature museum or something. So I went into the museum, and the people at the front desk didn't seem to notice me. I walked right by. I went inside. I looked around, skeletons of this, and, this is what a squirrel nest looks like and whatnot. But they had this case that was a beehive. And, it was sandwiched in between sheets of glass, and it had a light over it. There was a tube where the bees would come in and out, and the queen had like a blue dot on her, so you could follow her around. So I was mesmerized by these bees. So I'm watching the bees and whatever for, I don't know, half an hour, 45 minutes or so. And then I turn around and I notice that the lights are all off in this museum. And I'm like, oh, it must be closed. So I go to the front door, I push, the crash bar, I go outside. I bump into one of the other altar boys. Arthur, where you been? Everybody's looking for you. I can hear them all up in the woods calling my name and everything. I'm like, oh, I was in there the whole time. And he's like, that place has been closed for an hour. I'm like, I don't know. That's where I was. So he starts yelling, we found him, we found him. So everybody comes down, and, the priest asked me where I was. And I said I was in the museum there watching the bees. He said, no, you weren't. It's been closed for 45 minutes. I said, well, that's where I was. And he said, if you lie to a priest, you're going right to hell. When you die, you're going to hell. So where were you? And I said, I was in there. So at this point, I'm 12. Now I'm crying. I don't know. The priest is yelling at me. And then he actually had a vote with all the altar boys. Should we let him stay, or should we kick him out? What's he, Caesar? Thumbs up, thumbs down? So needless to say, that was my last day as an altar boy. And maybe that saved me, because I don't know if this guy was a kid toucher, but a few of the other priests were. So anyway, growing up in Charlestown, it was the best of times, but it was the worst of times as well. And, there were days when we had fried bologna for dinner, and there were days when we had steak. And in retrospect, I prefer to remember the days we had steak. So long for now.